am just so proud now to introduce a wonderful whistleblower, an incredible advocate for whistleblowers, a wonderful creative podcaster, Dr. Allison Gill. Please welcome her to the stage, and thank you everyone for coming.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Siri. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Jane. I appreciate that. I just wanted to open up today by reminding everyone that they need to be wary of those who would silence a whistleblower. Just like Stephen was talking about, the donor who gave money, but behind the scenes was, calling us disgruntled. None of us intended to find ourselves here. I don't think anyone sets out to be a whistleblower. When you were asked what you wanted to be when you grew up, I doubt any of us said whistleblower. In fact, when we were kids, it had a negative connotation, didn't it? We were called tattletale, snitch, stool pigeon. The Brady Bunch did a whole episode about it. But oftentimes, those unspoken rules of blind loyalty and obedience are written by the bad guys and the false patriots. Now, we're all leaders by nature. And Jane, you said you had that really interesting podcast with the person who talked about, the characteristics of whistleblowers and the characteristics of those who would try to silence us. And so I'm sure we're all very familiar with, and we've all probably taken countless seminars and leadership programs that teach us the different kinds of leadership. There's authoritarian leadership, where your power comes from simply being in charge. Participative leadership, where you're on the floor doing the work. There's delegative leadership, where you hand out tasks to others. And then there's transactional and transformational leaders. Transactional leaders are like tit for tat, and transformational leaders have a vision, and then they inspire others and empower them to achieve that vision. So those who would retaliate against a whistleblower are often authoritarian or transactional leaders. And those who celebrate us are often transformational leaders. But they can really be anywhere. So we really need to get out there and change the idea that whistleblowing is a bad thing. So how do we do that? First, we must tell our stories. That's why I love the Whistleblower podcast with Jane. And my story is a weird one. I didn't report fraud in my agency. I reported fraud in the entirety of an administration. What did I do? Well, I started a podcast. The podcast was called Mueller, She Wrote. Sometime in October of 2017, while working at the Department of Veterans Affairs as a liaison to the Department of Defense for TRICARE, I was kicking back one Friday night watching the news because I know how to party. And MSNBC was showing an older documentary from 2013 or so. They were rerunning it, and it's called All the President's Men Revisited. It had all the normal talking heads, Lawrence O'Donnell, Rachel Maddow. The Mueller investigation was well underway, and I think they were showing the documentary to demonstrate the parallels between Watergate and the Trump-Russia probe. And it dawned on me as I was watching it that in a couple of decades, we'll probably be seeing a documentary on the Mueller investigation, maybe several. And I really wanted to be a part of that. But I don't have a Columbia journalism degree, and I don't have a news desk. So I decided to start a podcast. I bought a couple of low-end microphones, set them up on my kitchen table. And that weekend came the first indictments of Paul Manafort and Rick Gates. So we recorded our first episode. And then I began seeing those annual fraud, waste, and abuse trainings that we have to take play out in my head. Was what I was doing legal? Was it ethical? Most of us here today ask ourselves those questions all the time, because as government employees, it's in our DNA to be ethical. It's part of the culture of government, right? Like we ask questions like, well, Jenny's having a baby shower. Where is she in the chain of command? Can I spend more than $20? Can we do it at lunch? We ask ourselves these questions all the time. So I was doing this podcast. I hired some lawyers who were experts on things like the Hatch Act and ethics, government ethics. And I did what any normal government employee would do. I wrote out some standard operating procedures and guidelines, memo style, for my podcast, Nerd Alert. I made sure I did everything by the book. I didn't want to toe any line. I used a pseudonym. I called myself AG. I didn't tweet or record or write or perform during work hours, even if I was on leave. I didn't fundraise for political candidates. I never talked about my agency or my title. I certainly never spoke on behalf of the government. No reasonable administration could find fault with what I was doing. But we weren't dealing with a reasonable administration. So on April 3rd of 2019, just as I was about to begin a 20-part series outlining the Mueller report, line by line, with jokes, my two freshly appointed supervisors, one with the job I had turned down the previous year because I couldn't move to DC, they flew out to San Diego on your dime and sought a meeting with me at a very pricey hotel at San Diego Bay. And they sat me down by the pool and informed me that my position as the West Region Tri-Care Liaison was moving to DC. And I had two choices, move or be fired. I thanked them for the information. I let them know I would think about it. Excuse me. I had until August 6th to decide, but I already knew I wasn't going to move. I didn't last time they offered me a promotion in DC. So I put in for the 12 weeks of leave I had earned over the last decade plus of service. And in June, I signed the letter and checked the box that said I would not be moving. And I sat around at home and waited to be fired. July came and went, and I was due back at work in DC on August 6th, but I had declined to move there. And on August 3rd, my supervisor informed me I was to come back to work Monday morning. I asked for telework since DC was kind of a challenging commute from San Diego. And he instructed me to put in a formal request, which I did. And we scheduled a call for Monday morning, which I expected to be the typical, hey, welcome back, here's what you missed, kind of a call. But when I answered the phone Monday morning, I was told I was under investigation and that I had to answer my supervisor's questions because he was conducting a fact-finding inquiry. So I asked for representation and I was denied. Then they proceeded to launch into a dime store, wannabe Perry Mason show court line of questioning. They asked me to go to the internet. Is your internet open? Type the following into the URL address bar. And they read off this long Twitter address, twitter.com/user/496. Like they read the whole thing number by number to me. And it took me to a Twitter post of a video, and it asked me to play the video. Now, the video was of me on stage at the Parkway Theater in Minneapolis, taken not only while I was on earned leave, but on a Saturday night. And they had me watch this video. Now, as most of you can imagine, I was terrified. I was under inquiry. There was a fact-finding investigation into me. My heart was pounding. Had I violated some rule? Had I run afoul of some ethics policy or the Hatch Act? And I wasn't terrified because I didn't want to get in trouble. I was terrified because I thought I had done something wrong. How much trouble was I in here? So I hit play and I watched as I led a sold-out theater in 3-part harmony of the phrase, Manafort is effed. And then I gave my closing remarks. I left the stage. The audience jumps up, gives me an ovation. So now I'm terrified, but I'm also laughing so hard that I have to mute my telecom mic. And then I hear from the other end of the phone, is that you? Of course, well, first I asked for representation again, to which he replied, are you refusing a direct order from your supervisor? So I answered, yes, of course it's me. You've worked with me for over a decade. It's obviously me. Now, this went on for a while. Him taking me to different web addresses like MuellerSheWrote.com/about/hosts, and then scroll down. Is that you? You know, this went on for a very long time. When it was about 2 hours when the call was through. And right after, I phoned my lawyers and we strategized about what to do. I told them I couldn't go back into the office anymore. And besides, I was just waiting around to be fired. Why don't they just fire me already? So I put in that telework request that I was forced to put in, even though I was a couple thousand miles away. Now, I had already been teleworking 2 days a week, and I had a telework agreement in place. And surely they wouldn't reject a 100% telework request because, again, I was in San Diego. And while we were waiting for that, my supervisor was giving me retaliatory work, if you know what I mean. Like asking me to create a spreadsheet of all 1,800 veteran hospice locations with their phone numbers and managers and emails. All of that information is available on the internet, by the way. And not long after that, they said they would approve my telework agreement if I signed, or they would approve my telework if I signed this new telework agreement, which they sent me. And as you might expect, the agreement was ridiculous and retaliatory. I had to answer the phone in 5 rings or less. I couldn't let it go to voicemail. My messenger had to show green, available at all times. I had to send an email every morning announcing to my supervisors when I would take my breaks and lunches. I had to reply to all emails within 5 minutes. This was a telework agreement for someone who'd been caught abusing telework, but I never had. I had nothing but outstanding performance evaluations for my entire tenure at the VA, and I was a GS-14. My lawyers responded on my behalf saying, she's not going to sign this. This is retaliatory. And an hour later, I informed my supervisors per policy that I needed 30 minutes of administrative leave the next day to meet with an EEO counselor. And within 2 hours of my lawyers accusing them of retaliation and me asking for EEO time, my supervisor sent the crazy telework agreement to all my coworkers to make it look like he wasn't singling me out. Time is linear, though. We can see what you're doing. I put in for leave without pay until they made a decision on firing me, and they rejected that. So I got a doctor's note, had my lawyer send it again, and they approved it for 30 days and said I would have to reapply again every 30 days, which my lawyers also called retaliatory. And eventually, on March 25th, 2020, nearly a year after the meeting at the San Diego Harbor Hotel, they fired me for being medically unfit. So I sued for my severance and won. I sued for damages, which is still pending. I found out later through a FOIA request that the secretary of the VA, the secretary, Wilkie, had been monitoring my social media, and they had particular interest in my posts about the VA Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Office. I also learned that the President's Office of General Counsel had been advising my supervisor on his investigation. But like most transactional leaders, he was incapable of second-level thinking. They fired me in March 2020, 8 months before the presidential election. Had they been smart about it, they'd have kept me on and let me telework, because I would have been bound by the Hatch Act. But now I was free from the constraints of it, and I was able to raise $500,000 for Biden and Harris and Ossoff and Warnock. So yes, he did fire me, but in his haste for revenge, I was able to help fire him. Now, every single person listening today has what it takes to speak out. This isn't just about those of us willing to stand up to corruption and fraud, waste and abuse. It's about reframing institutions to become the best versions of themselves by creating environments where making mistakes is normal. It's seen as an opportunity for improvement, and where reporting them is actually celebrated, not punished. Just as we celebrate whistleblowers here today, we can take this idea of encouraging accountability forward into our own lives and our own organizations. By the very virtue of having the courage to speak out, we are leaders, and being brave enough to face the music gives us the power to lead. So what can we do besides speak truth to power and share our stories? We can become the leaders who celebrate it. And by the grace of the universe, maybe others will see us leading and want to see that kind of accountability and bravery in themselves and those they lead. We saw it a few years ago as people were encouraged by those who came forward to tell their stories in the Me Too movement. Thousands of people knowing they're not alone and mustering the strength to come forward. because when you know you're not alone, they can't gaslight you. We saw it in Shay Moss and her mother, Ruby Freeman, when they told millions of Americans on national television their real story of being the targets of the administration after having their lives turned upside down. We've seen it recently in the testimony of Cassidy Hutchinson and the wave of others who saw that 25-year-old woman sit before Congress and tell the truth, despite phone calls threatening her to stand down, and entire agencies like the Secret Service saying that she was not telling the truth, but then unwilling to come and testify under oath themselves. I call this the Me Too movement, and it's catching. We inspire each other. And if we can save this little experiment called American democracy, I envision institutions and agencies that reward that kind of good trouble. And I think all of us here today already have the power to inspire others to that end. Thank you so much, Jane, Siri, everyone, Stephen, for having me today. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gill. Those remarks were so rousing. I'm so happy we have that recorded, and I really, really hope that anybody who didn't have a chance to join in contemporaneously is able to actually listen to those, because your story is moving, your perspective and your strengths are so inspiring and motivating, and you are not alone, and your story reminds others that they too are not alone, especially the savvy approach you took to making sure that everything was well documented and you could stand up for yourself with the help of a good attorney. So everybody check out Mueller, She Wrote podcast, check out the whole media empire that Dr. Allison Gill is building, and celebrate her story along with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And if you're into news with a little bit of swearing, you can check out my weekday morning podcast called The Daily Beans.
Absolutely. So we're wrapping up for the day. Thank you so much for joining us for our 2022 celebration of National Whistleblower Day. This marks the 244th anniversary of that first significant decision made by the Continental Congress to protect those courageous whistleblowers at the basis of our democracy. So I really want to just thank everybody from the House Office of the Whistleblower Ombuds all the way to Allison Gill for joining us and presenting, sharing their wisdoms and stories, bringing their blood, sweat, and tears to us today. And every single person that tuned in, your time is highly valuable, and we appreciate you sharing it with us. So for the last time, happy National Whistleblower Day. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.